Hello, everybody. Looks like we have enough people coming in that I can get started. So welcome. We're so glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Shay Quarry, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our presenter, Brendan Meyer from the Historic Preservation Office, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. For those of you who might be new to DCPL, we are a Washington, D.C. citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. So just a few things to go over before we get started. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They're the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTech Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Antonovich Associates, Buyer Blender Bell, EHT Tracers Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So moving on, just a few notes about how the webinar will run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through those towards the end of the program. The chat will not be available during the presentation, but at the end, we'll turn that on so that you can leave comments. But again, please put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll go through those first. If you're joining us on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring questions there. You can submit them in the comments and he'll send them to us here on Zoom. So now that we've covered all of that, I'm so pleased to introduce you to today's speaker. Brendan Meyer has studied, worked, and been a bike commuter in the District of Columbia for 30 years. He's been with the DC Historic Preservation Office since 2006, where he does design review and manages the Historic Homeowner Grant Program. Originally from New Jersey, he holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame. In his spare time, he's a woodworker, turning neighborhood trees into furniture using nothing but hand tools. Brendan, thank you for being here today. We're really excited that you could do this presentation for us, and I will turn it over to you.
Of course. Thanks for the introduction. For the presentation today, I figured that I would walk everybody through the HPRB process and where we keep our public information. So basically, I'm putting myself in your eyes. So that way, after today's conversation, you could hear how things work. You could see where things are and have enough information that when you're ready to do your project in a week, in a month, or next year, you could come back, sit down, start with Google, find our website, and pick up from where we leave off today. So in terms of finding the best information for our review process, conveniently enough, there is only one HPRB in the world as far as my Google is concerned. So if you Google HPRB, we'll land right at the top of your search. And our website is part of the Office of Planning website for DC government, planning.dc.gov. The Historic Preservation Office is part of the Office of Planning. And this is basically your headquarters for design review information. What being in a historic district means, what the rules and regulations are about what you can and can't do to your historic property, permit requirements, permit process, how the HPRB process works for bigger projects. So all of your answers rest right here. But this group today is going to be focusing on how the review process works. And so fundamentally, the first thing to understand, if we go to meeting calendar, is that HPRB is a regulatory body appointed by the mayor, and they meet once a month. And that is our baseline organization. Typically, they meet on the fourth Thursday of every month, except for months with holidays like November, December, and they don't meet in August. It's important for owners and architects to understand this baseline schedule in terms of project design timelines. If you're going to require HPRB review, you're going to be anchored to these dates. So you should keep that in mind as you schedule your design projects, or as a homeowner, you're going to want to consult with staff, keeping in mind on these dates, because your project may have to go to HPRB. So the calendar is very important. It's fundamental. When considering a project, one thing that I forgot to mention, what I'm going to discuss today only concerns the historic districts that HPRB has jurisdiction over. I'm not going to cover topics particular to Georgetown. The Georgetown Historic District is different because it's regulated by the federal government through the Commission of Fine Arts and the old Georgetown Board. That's a separate process. And HPO and HPRB defer 99% of the time to the decisions of the old Georgetown Board, and their process is different. They don't have staff sign-offs. Every case has to go to the board, to their board in Georgetown. So today we're only going to be discussing all of the other historic districts and the DC process. The entire structure of the Preservation Office and the design reviewers is set up to encourage as early as possible that owners and designers consult with staff as soon as possible in a project. There's a lot of basic information that could be sorted out with an email conversation or a phone conversation that could sort out issues of architectural importance, historic importance, what things should be protected, what things aren't original, what things could be replaced, and the general scope of an addition or new construction, and what the fundamental preservation principles are. A lot of that can be taken care of in a phone conversation, and our office is set up to do that. So please email and call us with your questions. And one of the things that will absolutely result from that conversation will be you will be advised whether or not your project can be reviewed by staff, and so you could go straight to a permit application that staff can receive and approve, because staff does have the authority to approve several types of work. It's called delegated authority under our regulations. Basically, about 20 years ago, all permit applications went to HPRB, and HPRB had to review all of them. And it was hundreds of them a month. And eventually they decided to, instead, all the simple, easy cases that are approvable without much thought can be delegated to staff. Our numbers since then have been basically that 90% of permits issued in historic districts are approved by HPO staff without an HPRB hearing. People who may be familiar with historic districts outside of DC, they come from a different state or city. And since every state or city is different, a lot of people who have experience in historic districts outside of DC are surprised about how much authority is delegated to HPO staff in terms of what we're allowed to approve. That is a situation that our office and board are very happy with, because it expedites a lot of unnecessary waiting time. So 90% of our projects are taken care of very quickly by just going through permit. I'm going to find one thing on here to help you with that. The contact HPRB link does not have what I have. When in doubt, Google is better than the architecture of our website. To contact any staff reviewer in HPO, you want to find the historic district assignments. This is a roster of all of the reviewers and their assignments in historic districts, HPO staff contacts. From that list, you'll see every historic district listed. You simply have to look up your historic district and then find the contact information for the primary contact, the primary reviewer. So all of these people listed here are the design reviewers who approve permits, take cases to HPRB. There's also a secondary contact. So we're set up in a redundant system, so that way, if the primary contact is unavailable for leave or any unplanned event, there's a secondary contact. And not only is that helpful for people who are trying to get a quick answer, they have two people that they could contact. What happens when people contact us? Most questions are relatively straightforward, and the answers are really quick. But there are occasions where the question lands in a funny place in our design review or design guidelines, and there's some interpretation that has to be sorted out, or an ambiguity figured out. So what our office does is, it's not simply, when I do a design review in Shaw Historic District, that's one of my historic districts, I'm representing the office, but the decisions ultimately aren't the decisions of Brendan Meyer. They're the decisions of the Historic Preservation Office. So if there's ever a tricky question to resolve about a design issue within our office, our practice is I will immediately go to my secondary, Amanya Price, and we will discuss the issue back and forth. The pros and cons, the problems, what are possible solutions. So that way, we very quickly shift into a team-based approach if necessary. That also allows the secondary reviewer to be familiar with the context of the historic district in the event that the secondary has to step up and play my role temporarily. So we like that we have this built-in redundancy feature, so that way we have double coverage. If a question in Shaw is still too difficult for Amanya and me to figure out, our office is very studio-based, collaborative workspace. We'll instantly just call in the other reviewers. We'll make it an office-wide decision, and then get back to the owner or the architect. And so the most difficult questions get our most attention, and they are presented as the position of the office and not any one individual within the Historic Preservation Office. So the staff contact, the HBO staff contacts list, that's basically your phone numbers and emails for the staff person you're going to want to talk to about your project. When you give staff a call about your project, we will explain to you the design guidelines and regulations that apply to your design situation. The design guidelines and regulations are essentially the rules that have been promulgated by HPRB and adopted by adopted by HPRB. And those are the rules that help guide HPRB when they make their decisions. So when HPO staff is reviewing a project, not only are they basing their quick response on our long experience, but we're going to some foundational rules, so to speak. And these are presented in design guidelines. And this page on our website for design guidelines is that library of information for you. And they're going to be divided up into building component sections to cover your specific topic. And you'll find two levels of regulations. For instance, the window repair and replacement regulations, they are based on actual preservation code, but it's an illustrated guideline that will explain the importance of windows, the types of windows, and then the characteristics that should be preserved, replicated, or reproduced in a window repair or a window replacement project. The guidelines are enumerated, so ideas and concepts and reasons are outlined specifically, and that helps to cite rules adopted by the board. It helps that if the question goes to HPRB, a staff report might refer to the design guidelines by number, so that way we're very specific about what rules, decisions, and deliberations are being based on. that also, of course, helps keep our design review consistent between projects because we're always foundationally going back to our design guidelines. Some of our design guidelines, you'll see just by the different format, are older. They're more generic. These are from the late 90s. In fact, I illustrated most of it when I was a grad student for the office in the 90s. So these are extremely old. The information is very basic for this series of guidelines. It's more definitional and gives vocabulary. But for the issues that have been more numerous recently, the board will do design guidelines as necessary. So about 10 years ago, basement entrances became a very common design proposition put in front of the board. And they hadn't developed design guidelines specifically, so they were struggling a lot of the same questions and the same deliberations when it came to basement entrances. And so because of that workload, the board developed design guidelines. So that way their design review can be consistent about what parts of an entrance should be preserved or not altered. What's important about a historic entrance? Let's protect that. Where is there space to be flexible on design issues? How is it best to do a new basement entrance in a compatible fashion? What should you not do? An owner or architect that is considering a basement entrance has a guideline available. If they read through the guidelines, they will understand the principles that the board is operating under, and the owner and designer will also understand the basic rules of the game they're about to play. I like board games. I think that regulations are exactly like the rules in board games. But fundamentally, they are rules, and can really help guide how something could be designed, or what kind of information an owner or designer has to provide in order to make a case before HPRB that what they're proposing is compatible with the historic district. A similar, very well developed guideline for new utility meters, which had become a problem for HPRB. So they developed design guidelines specifically to the question of utility meters. And in this case, they developed these guidelines with PEPCO themselves. So when these were drafted, PEPCO was involved in drafting them because for that issue, we understand that PEPCO is a major player in the parameters of where meters can go. We also have some bigger, more broad-minded guidelines. The one on sustainability was developed in partnership with the Department of Energy and Environment, and is a more broad look at the role of preserving historic buildings in terms of maintaining a sustainable city. So guidelines like this are informative on a big policy basis, and may be helpful as supportive reasoning for a project. But these guidelines aren't necessarily about design compatibility issues that are the fundamental questions of HPRB. This is a broader policy document, but that's also available. While we're here, one other guideline that's extremely helpful, especially for designers, is a public realm design manual that was developed by the public space planner in the Office of Planning, along with DDOT. And the concept of public space is somewhat unique in DC, but it plays a fundamental role in how our downtown neighborhoods have been built and the character that they have, and how private property intersects with public space is very important to the architectural composition of our oldest neighborhoods, but also all of our neighbors. neighborhoods throughout the city. This guideline is extremely helpful because it outlines what otherwise is a very mind-numbing regulatory piece of text when it comes to DDOT's public space regulations. This is replete with illustrations and diagrams and definitions and plain English explanations of regulations that are within the public space regulations. It's very informative and helpful for designers or anyone trying to deal with the intersection of public space and private space. So I'm gonna be happy that I brought that to your attention because it's an excellent manual for those issues. Highly recommend that you keep that on hand if you're a designer in the city. So back to the idea that staff approves 90% of building permits. The first question that we'll address is whether or not your work even needs a permit. And Shay, if this PDF isn't showing up, please let me know.
It looks good. I can see it.
Okay, great. This is a real simple memo. Basically, when do you need a building permit for work in a historic district? That question is defined in the building code. The building code is the municipal regulation that establishes what work requires a building permit. We're just kind of plugged into the building code, the Historic Preservation Office regulations. But if the building code says you need a permit, you need a permit. That's the answer. This one-page document I share frequently with owners and architects, especially new owners. It's very helpful because the premise of the building code is that every alteration or new structure or demolished structure, everything needs a building permit, is what the building code says. And then it says, in this first set of bullets, except for certain types of work. And this first group of exceptions applies inside or outside of a historic district. Doesn't matter where you are in DC, this type of work doesn't require a building permit. Ordinary repairs, window screens and storm windows, countless interior finishing sorts of elements like countertops and cabinets, don't need a building permit. A swing set for a family, don't need a building permit. And that's true anywhere in a historic district. Then, however, the building code said, after it presents those exceptions, it says, except if you're in a historic district, you do need the building permit. So there's a separate section that returns these items of work back to needing a building permit if you're in a historic district. You don't need a permit if you're outside a historic district, but you do need a permit if you're inside a historic district for this work. The most common is brick repointing. And then there's a number of others. So in that case, we'll help you approve your building permit, but you need the building permit that you otherwise wouldn't need. The one thing to know about this, and this is more secret than it should be, but a number of years ago, council decided that if people are getting a building permit only because they're in a historic district, they should get a reduced permit fee. So these permits are issued as BH permits. It's a permit designation that the Department of Buildings puts on the permit to designate that as a permit only needed because you're in a historic district. These permits, instead of costing 2% of the value of work, that's how building permits are valued. That's the price of a building permit. It's 2% of the value of the work. A BH permit only costs $33, so it's a nominal fee. And sometimes that could save a good chunk of change. DOB doesn't really make it too obvious how to get a BH permit. I've toggled over to a memo that we could provide people. And unfortunately, we have to keep updating this because DOB keeps moving the process. I'm showing this to everyone just to tell them to always hope and know that if they're looking for a historic property special permit in the DOB system, although it's buried and not obvious, it is in there. And you can find that when you apply for a building permit, go through the process. If you're eligible for if you're eligible for a BH permit and you're not finding it, just call our office. we'll help you get the cheap permit, and we want to save you some money too. And we just wish that this function of the DOB system was a little bit more prominent for our constituents in historic districts. But it is there, and we'll help you find it. So when you consult with staff, we'll identify important parts of your building, what makes your house significant, so therefore what should be preserved or maintained. Are there components of the building that aren't original to the historic district? So removing them is not problematic. Then it becomes a question of what is the new component or new product going to look like? In those sorts of situations, the board standard is that the new element should try to replicate as much as possible the original historic element, not the most recent. So in general, this is an idea that applies to windows and doors. Windows and doors that may have been replaced in the 70s and now need replacement again. But the things that are coming out of the building that need replacement, they're not historic elements, and they don't match the appearance of what the original element was. The board's position on this is that the new element should, wherever possible, match the configuration and appearance of the original historic element. So the way something appears right now, if it's not historic, that can be kept by the homeowner as long as they can squeeze life out of it. If they have a old vinyl door from 20 years ago, it gets to serve its purpose as long as possible. But when the owner decides it needs replacement, we don't want to match that door. We want to have a door installed that improves the historic character of the building by appearing like the original historic door. That in most cases we can figure out what that would have looked like. A lot of these questions that staff handles really aren't too ambiguous. They aren't hard to figure out, and we could get you straight on the path of a building permit. But based on our guidelines and the complexity of the scope of the project or the planned addition, there might be some ambiguities or basically ambiguities about whether or not the proposal is going to be compatible with historic or not. If staff in their consideration ever gets to the point of thinking that they don't know if HPRB would approve it, it's a little ambiguous, it's a little unclear. If in our decision making we can't figure out if the board would approve it, that essentially tells us that it's a case that requires review by HPRB. HPO staff is allowed to approve a lot of things under this delegated review. A lot of questions are very simple. But fundamentally, we're acting on behalf of the board. And the logical approach is, if we look at a design question or a permit application, and we are confident the board would approve this, then that fundamentally tells us that we could approve it on their behalf. But if we ever get to a point of not being sure about that answer, if it's even just a little ambiguous, we're supposed to forward that application to HPRB for an HPRB review. So that's an explanation of how logically we get to an HPRB review instead of a staff review. A little bit different. There are some exceptions to that, in that certain types of work just flat out aren't delegated to HPO staff for approval. An example of that is a row house that may have historically had a porch, but doesn't have a porch anymore. And an owner wants to reconstruct the historic porch on the front of the building. That would be a major alteration to the current circumstances. It sounds like a good idea. But HPRB wants to handle that question themselves. They want to make sure that historic porch really actually did exist. That the new porch being proposed really actually does replicate what used to exist. Philosophically and academically, that could be a tricky question. one that the board wants to get right. So work like that, they have not delegated to staff. Even if staff thinks that the proposal is really a reconstruction of a missing historic element, if we think it's a great example of reconstruction, we could have that opinion and we could put it in a staff report. We just don't have the authority to approve that sort of work. HPRB wants to see that themselves. Another type of work applies to rear additions. Most of our residential historic districts are row houses, so we deal with a lot of rear additions that don't have a lot of visibility to the street. So they kind of categorize themselves as relatively straightforward design issues. And HPO staff is allowed to approve a lot of alterations on the rear of properties when visibility from a street is not a major issue, where the addition is not prominent to the public. But the board does have a limit to what it allows staff to review. And simply, anything big the board wants to see, even if staff thinks it's completely compatible. And those numbers are basically, if an addition adds 250 square feet of footprint to the building, the board wants to see it. Or if the addition would add a cumulative amount of 500 square feet of new interior space, the board wants to see it. So those numbers basically define an addition that's bigger than a one-room addition per floor, generally speaking. If an addition is under those numbers, staff is going to review it and approve it if everything else about it is compatible. If it's over those numbers of 250 and 500, it goes to HPRB. And so how does HPRB work? This part of our website has all the information that you'll need to submit your application and understand the process that you're going to have to go through. Applying to HPRB has a page of instructions. It has the HPO staff contacts again. Bullet points about when work requires HPRB review, which I've already discussed. Materials, an application form. Simply, submission to HPRB starts with an application form. You download it right here. It's asking for basic information. There are two types of reviews you can file for HPRB: concept review and permit review. Most reviews by HPRB are concept reviews, and the best way to think about design review is if you have no drawings and no ideas, you're at 0% of your design stage, your design process. If you have a permit and blueprints in hand, your design is 100% complete. So 0 to 100%. Concept review takes place when you've designed about 50% of your project. You're 50% of the way through design. You have an idea of what you're going to have to demolish. You have an idea of how big of an addition you're going to build and where you're going to attach it to your building. You have a general idea of floor plans and room layouts. You have a general idea of materials, what kind of siding, what kind of roofing materials are you going to use. Basically, you have enough information to show somebody what it's generally going to look like. That's a concept review. The board wants to see concept reviews at that 50% design stage because the owner and the designer isn't calling in their engineers or the technical designers or finishing every part of their design yet. Conceptual review is going to take place before the mechanical engineers and the electricians do their plans and all the engineering for the building. So it's better for all parties to answer conceptual questions at the 50% design stage, so that way HPRB can set the limits of what's allowed in the historic district before the owner goes ahead and designs the entire project. So that's essentially the idea of conceptual review. On occasion, permit reviews have to go to HPRB for their approval instead of staff. And permit reviews are permit plans. When you submit a permit review, you're submitting a permit application with a number assigned by DOB, and you're submitting the permit drawings that were submitted to DOB. You're also submitting them to HPRB for their review. But most of the work that an owner does with HPRB or a designer does with HPRB are going to be concept reviews. The application collects basic information from the owner. You let us know the status of your thinking of the project. You give us a little narrative. You let us know if you've thought about your zoning questions, if you talk to your neighbors. You basically give us some background information in those regards. And you submit your application to our general inbox. And what you'll receive from our staff are a couple things. You'll receive an invoice to pay the filing fee, which I believe is a nominal $100. It's not very much. Larger commercial projects, the fee goes up. In addition to that, you will also receive information about notification requirements. HPRB is a public review body. Its meetings are open to the public and recorded. The public is welcome to present testimony to HPRB. So because it's a public meeting, public notice requirements are necessary. Basically, the applicant has to post a placard on the property announcing the date of the meeting, and the owner has to make their plans available to adjacent neighbors and neighbors across the street. HPO provides the addresses where plans have to be sent. So HPO does that bit of work for you. But applicants have to make sure to take care of their notice requirements. Failure to do so may delay review of an HPRB project. The other item of public notice work that goes on is HPO publishes a public notice. We publish a monthly public notice. This is going to be for our last meeting. I'm just looking for a copy of a public notice. Here we go. This is from our last meeting. Public notice is published by our office to a distribution list. It includes ANCs, organizations, and individuals who want to be on our distribution list. It includes information about how to testify and submit testimony to the HPRB meetings, how to submit comments, an explanation of the roles of ANCs. The role of ANCs is very important to the HPRB process. The law, the enacting legislation behind ANCs gives them great weight before regulatory bodies in DC government like HPRB. So when an owner or designer files an application from HPRB, they receive information that they should also be filing their design with their local ANC and seeking the opinion of the ANC on the compatibility of their project. This has to be done separate from the HPRB filing process, but it should be done parallel to it. The ANCs are going to be on their own different calendars of meetings. They may not synchronize conveniently with HPRBs. The responsibility is on the ANC to let us know if there is a project that they want to comment on, but they don't have time for. So if the ANC sees a project on a public notice, but it hasn't been presented to them by the owner or the applicant, they will contact our office and ask for a postponement of 1 month to give the applicant time to present their design to the ANC. Sometimes because the calendars aren't synchronized, that's just not going to be possible. So they need to use the postponement just so that way the calendars can sync up. The law requires that we give ANCs 45 days to review projects and submit their opinion to HPRB. So the idea that the ANC can postpone a hearing is in order to afford them the 45 days required by law. Once 45 days are provided, in most cases, the applicants have presented to the ANC. The ANC has held their meetings. They've passed the resolutions. They've submitted that information to HPRB. If it takes longer than 45 days, then the HPRB chair has discretion whether or not to continue to hold an HPRB meeting waiting for ANC. At some point, HPRB chair can determine that there's been enough time for that review, and after 45 days can continue with an HPRB case. The ANC comment that's provided to HPRB is done so at the meeting. It becomes part of the testimony. HPRB does not have to agree with the recommendation of the ANC, but it does have to give it great weight. And great weight under the law means they have to incorporate the reasoning of the ANC and the ANC's opinion. They have to incorporate that into their deliberations. And if the ANC presents a specific point why something is compatible or incompatible or should be approved or should not be approved, HPRB in their deliberations has to address that point and essentially respond to it and explain why they don't agree with the ANC. So the ANCs do play a fundamental role when you're going before HPRB. So it's very important that an applicant, an owner, an architect conduct the coordination between ANC and HPRB and make sure that when you file for HPRB, you also follow the advice to appear before your local ANC. When you file your design, your application, staff will contact you, let you know what they think is compatible or incompatible about your design, and advise you to make any revisions that staff thinks will improve the compatibility of your project. Those revisions can be done quickly, and you have up until 21 days before the meeting to revise your design. The 21 days is longer than what it used to be, but we've extended that period to make sure that any revisions done after filing for HPRB can also be shared with ANC. So that way the designs are consistent before both ANC and HPRB. But that quick initial consultation from staff that discusses what's compatible or incompatible about your design will also give you and your designer an idea of the staff report that's being drafted by staff. Staff is very careful that whatever they advise an owner or designer is compatible or incompatible about their design, that the staff report is going to be consistent with that advice. That's of primary importance for our office to be consistent in the advice we give. Now, what it does mean, however, is staff is going to write a staff report, submit it to HPRB for your hearing. So when you have your hearing for HPRB, HPRB is going to see the drawings, and they're going to receive a staff report from the office that makes a recommendation whether the project should be approved, not approved, or if it needs to be revised to be compatible. That staff report is going to reflect the advice that staff has given the applicant, but HPRB does not always agree with staff. So there are occasions where HBO staff will advise an applicant or designer what's compatible, what's incompatible. That goes in the staff report. but HPRB comes to a different decision. So that's possible. HBO staff can't control HPRB's decisions. We can only advise their decisions. HPO advice may not match what HPRB ultimately decides. But what HPO staff does is remain consistent between what we advise you in our early consultations and what we end up putting in our staff reports. So I'll walk you through a quick example of a concept design and what goes into that. This is for a new apartment building in Shaw Historic District on a vacant site. The concept design presents perspective, a narrative of the project, site plans, photographs of the context and surrounding neighborhood, and then whatever information the designer feels necessary to explain the general attributes of the design. In this case, a volume study, and then floor plans of the units for all the floors, a building section to show how setback the penthouse would be, perspective renderings or elevation renderings as necessary to show massing and building configuration, window types, materials. And from this, this is what HPRB refers to when they do the deliberations. In terms of the concept design reviews that our office sees, this is a very highly developed one in terms of its professional quality. But it has all the basic information that HPRB needs to answer the questions of how compatible would this new building be with this context. In the case of this project, this is a project that came to the board twice. The first time it was submitted, the staff report recommended that it was generally compatible with the historic district, but it did have components of it that required or deserved further discussion with the board. And so based on that and the deliberations of the board gave general concept approval at the first meeting, but not full approval because they wanted some designs to be further developed. This is the staff report that went to HPRB with the design. It lays out basically the property description and context of the historic district, a brief description of the proposal, and then it evaluates the compatibility of the historic district. And in this case, right off the bat, staff recommended that the historic district would benefit from a new building at this site and it was generally compatible, but there were some components that required further discussion. Questions about setback of the building from the neighboring church, how the balconies were arranged on the one facade. And the board took up that deliberation and gave it basic approval, but wanted to see some design, some details developed. And so the design came back about 4 months later for a second meeting. Most homeowner projects can be taken care of in one meeting with the HPRB. Occasionally for a homeowner project, it needs 2 meetings. Larger projects, new construction projects that are typically more complex, those usually take about 2 meetings. Once concept approval was completed by HPRB, then this project went into permit development and is still going through permit review with DOB right now. that's a basic review of the HBRB process. Very general, but I did want to show people where to go to on our website when it comes down to actually sitting down and starting real work on the project that you want to do. Each project is unique and individual, and our staff works very hard to work with each owner closely as they present their projects to HPRB, so that way they can be reviewed as efficiently and as well as possible. Shay, if you've clicked in any questions, I can answer those.
I have. Let's do it.
Those are usually better than what I have to say anyway. So what do you got?
Okay, the first question, what are some of the projects that DC's staff can review without HPRB involvement? Is it all small things such as HVAC systems, roof replacements, or does it also involve larger projects like new construction?
Right. The regulations categorize what work staff is allowed to approve. So new construction is an easy one. Staff cannot approve new construction. All new construction has to go to HPRB. The example that I gave of reconstructing a major element on the front of a building, like a porch that you think used to be there, staff can't approve that. That has to go to HPRB because HPRB considers that a very delicate, important theoretical questions about what's original. So there are categories of work that staff can't approve on behalf of the board. Another easy way to think about it: the bigger and more complicated and more visible and more prominent the projects, the more likely it's going to go to HPRB. A roof addition on a row house that's not visible from the street, staff is allowed to review. If it has some visibility issues, then it needs to go to HPRB. Since I brought it up real quick about visibility is a great shortcut to understanding and categorizing some of these things, but we're not technically reviewing for visibility. We just accept the premise that if it's not visible from a street, it's not prominent, there's really not the academic compatibility issue. Something can be visible from the street and still be deemed compatible with the historic district because it's of such minor visibility. So something can technically be visible, but still compatible with the historic district. So the board is not reviewing for visibility, it's reviewing for compatibility. Because in addition, there are some times where adding a penthouse or a new story on a building is going to be visible, but maybe it's compatible. But those questions would go to HPRB. That's not just a staff review.
Good to know. Next question. Can you provide an example of how the HPRB rules and guidelines allow homeowners to use energy efficient products or adjust a house for ADA compliance?
Not a specific example, but that's all part of our process. There are several ways to achieve energy efficiency with a historic building. Solar panels, staff approves solar panels hundreds of times a year, basically because of the same premise of additions. If solar panels are not visible from the street, we approve them. We approve solar panels in historic districts at the same rate that DOB approves them in the rest of the city. It's the same. Fundamentally, that's because most of our resources are row houses, and it's very easy for solar panels not to be visible on a row house. But even recently, HPRB has approved some visible solar panels in Tacoma and Cleveland Park because HPRB has seen new projects that have better materials. Solar panels are much smaller and thinner than they used to be. So the notion that just seeing a solar panel is incompatible with the historic district, HPRB decided that was no longer the case. But if the solar panel is visible, then it goes to HPRB. Window replacements are approvable projects. They just have to have the right materials and window configurations and trim so they look historic. But installing double pane windows, not an issue. there's lots of ways to make a historic building energy efficient, and they're mostly taken care of at the permit level. It's not difficult. In terms of ADA compliance, um, the guidelines that the board uses allow for accommodations. But in those cases, the role of HPRB is to make sure that the alteration is as compatible as possible with the historic district. So the board will never say that an accessibility structure can't be built, or you can't make something, you can't make some part of your building accessible. If it's an accessibility issue that's subject to ADA, the board will work on the design to make it as compatible as possible with the historic district. So that way it has the accessibility that is deserved under ADA, but as much as possible is compatible with the historic district.
How often is the public involved in, homeowner projects, or does the ANC typically get involved with
Well,
commercial
that's
projects?
that's a good question that I should explain the first time. Any permit that staff approves under staff delegation, the 90% of approved permits in historic districts, those are between the owner, HPO, and then straight to DOB. There's no part of that process that includes public participation. Separately and down the road, if it's there's some building code rules that apply anywhere in DC for a building permit, where DOB might require neighbor notification if your project is major and within a certain number of feet of an adjacent property, but that's a building permit issue. That's not part of the HPRB HPO process. The only time the public is involved with an HPRB project is when it's a public meeting. The meeting's in public. Anyone can testify. They have to, they sign up. They're on the Zoom call and they present testimony. Anyone in the public can testify on a project, a preservation organization, an ANC, a neighbor, somebody from, across the city. The ones that the board is going to give the most weight to the testimony that's most important. Affected party status is one notion. So a neighbor, obviously, is somebody that should be considered a little bit more than somebody from the other side of the city. But I say that because anyone from the public can testify. And again, just like HPRB doesn't have to agree with the ANC, HPRB is not taking a straw poll. They're not running a popularity contest. They'll listen to the testimony, and the more the testimony sticks to the concepts of compatibility and incompatibility, the more weight the board will put to those comments.
Great. Do realtors have to disclose this information to home buyers, or do people sometimes do projects without knowing about, HPRB?
More basically, that gets the idea of doing work without a permit. So in terms of law and regulation, everything is based on whether you need a building permit or not. And so if work is done without these processes, I think what we're really talking about is work done without a permit, or work that has a permit but exceeds the scope of the permit. Exceeds the scope of the permit is our lingo to say you had plans for an addition, but you also replaced all the windows on the front addition on the front facade. All right, you had a permit, but you did work that wasn't on the permit, so that exceeds. So it's work without a permit. It becomes a building code issue. Our HBO has inspectors with badge authority. Our inspectors will go out, and if they get reports of work without a permit, we cite it. First, we give a correction order asking the owner to correct it before we issue fines. So there's an opportunity to fix a mistake if that's the case. But failing that, it turns into a ticket that could be a fine. And those are municipal citations. If a project is ever cited with an NOI or a corrective order, that information, in the case of a sale or a property that transacts, if a property is under a correction order or an NOI, it is unlawful to sell that property without disclosing those violations or correcting those violations. So that's a statement in the building code. Enforcement of what it means to be unlawful usually comes up when we notify the new owner of this problem. The new owner uses that unlawful basis to go back to the seller and say, we got a problem. Ultimately, our position in that is just to make sure that the work done in historic districts is correct according to the permits that are issued. But that the role of an agent would be to make sure if a property ever sells, that the seller doesn't have a notice of infraction or corrective order against the property, an ongoing enforcement issue.
Yeah, good to know. Well, I know we're at time. There's a message from Scott Roberts about you, Brendan, your great work in Bloomingdale. He's grateful that you're the HPO staff reviewer there. And thank you again for doing this presentation. It was great. It will be up on YouTube probably early next week. And if you have any, questions for DCPL or for Brendan, you can email me and I will help you figure out what you need to figure out. But thank you so much, Brendan, for being here and amazing job. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Not a problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And hopefully we will cross paths again soon. But otherwise, have a great weekend. And thank you for all you do for preservation in DC.
You too. All right. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.